doctors have to be very careful about what they prescribe to their patients. And following evidence-based medicine is what we've learned works. We know that evidence and scientific testing actually does distinguish between the folk tales that are wrong and the things that actually do work.
The Rational View is a weekly series hosted by me, Dr. Alan Scott, providing a rational, evidence-based perspective on important societal issues.
Produced by Soapbox Media.
The world needs evidence-based public policy now more than ever. Making the right decisions should not be partisan politics. Please help spread The Rational View by going to patron.podbean.com/The Rational View. Together, we can make a better future. Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Rational View. I'm your host, Dr. Al Scott. This episode summarizes my investigations to date on nutrition and health. I've been looking at this for some time now, trying to interview the experts, the scientists behind the headlines, and I'd like to share with you what I've learned and also what I remain skeptical about. And in other podcast news, The Rational View has just had a major milestone. We broke 100,000 downloads. Thank you for your loyalty and for listening to me and sharing this journey. I appreciate the support that I get from all of my listeners, helping us to get exposure and spread the rational view. If you do like what you're hearing, I would love for you to hit like on your podcast app, share it with your friends, spread the word, maybe even write a review in your favorite app. So, my journey through healthcare and nutrition. My first interview was Marion Nestle. I was a leading authority on food and nutrition, and that podcast, the audio quality wasn't great, but it was a very good podcast. She was a very wise person who's been around, understands the politics of nutrition, and has lobbied hard to get labeling information on various products and food. So Marion taught us to minimize consumption of overly processed foods. Her advice was succinct. It was eat food, not too much, mostly plants. Very memorable message. Now, I've often heard the message to eat whole foods and avoid overly processed foods, but I've always wondered from a scientific sense what it was about processing that made foods unhealthy. Processing covers any number of procedures in my mind, right? It's a catch-all. You can mash your potatoes, that's processing. You can cook food, that's processing. Packaging, peeling. None of these on their own right is bad for you. So I was a bit skeptical of this whole claim. Is this coming from the naturalistic appeal to nature kind of, if it's natural, it's good, and if it's man-made, it's bad? Is that where this is coming from? So Marion Nestle clarified the main problems with ultra-processed food are the additives of high sugar, high sodium, and the fact that they're designed to be addictive. They're designed to be irresistible, and this results in overeating. And so that's a huge caloric intake. And of course, obesity is a major problem in our society with diabetes and the health impacts of that. My next interview was Dr. Edzard Ernst, who talked about what he called so-called alternative medicine. His acronym, of course, is SCAM, medicine that doesn't work. And I asked him about detox diets, and he said most of these are a scam. Our liver does the detox for us if it's working right, and you don't need a special diet for this to happen. His best quote from the interview was, "If something works, it's medicine. If it doesn't work, it cannot be medicine." Now, many folks think, in popular parlance, think that scientists are closed-minded because they dismiss ideas that have not been studied scientifically. Well, this is not the case. We're not closed-minded because of this. We are using a particular formula to determine, to make a judgment, right? And our formula is, if there is evidence and scientific and statistical evidence that supports it, then we are behind it. If there is not, then the question is open. And if people have studied it and they are unable to find any evidence that it works better than, say, a placebo, then if attempts to gather evidence for some particular medicine has failed, then it does not deserve to be called medicine. And, people don't like doctors because of this, I think. And I think that doctors have to be very careful about what they prescribe to their patients, or what they to follow evidence-based medicine, because if you do not, you're opening yourself up to being sued. And following evidence-based medicine is what we've learned works. We know that evidence and scientific testing actually does distinguish between the folk tales that are wrong and the things that actually do work. So it's not that we're closed-minded, right? So that's, I think, an important thing to consider. After Edzard Ernst, I talked to Dr. Peter Butt, who is a teetotaler and the head of the committee that tightened Canada's healthy alcohol guidelines recently. And he told us that all alcohol causes cancer, even in very small amounts. Any bit is dangerous. He, as chair of the committee, his committee reviewed data on mortality for various known health issues associated with alcohol. So things that we know alcohol makes worse. He looked at the dose versus health impact relationship and found that even small amounts increase risks. Now, a couple episodes later, I revisited this interview based on publicized skepticism about these guidelines. There was a lot of questions being asked, and there were groups putting forth statements to the effect that, this is biased, and they haven't looked at the J curve. So the J curve is the data, and there is a lot of data that show that small amounts of alcohol are actually protective for heart disease and decrease mortality. And there seems to be like a best amount of alcohol that protects you from heart disease, but doesn't really cause cancer. So I spent a lot of time researching this, and the complaints were brought up to the media by a group called ISFAR, the International Scientific Forum on Alcohol Research. And the members of this group had, many of them, accepted money from alcohol companies, and their advice is not respected by the scientists because of this controversial fact that they'd taken money from the alcohol industry. So what do we know? What's the hypothesis? Why does Dr. Butt and his committee believe that the J curve is actually bad science? Well, they came up with the sick quitter hypothesis, which was a confounding factor in many of the controlled studies of non-drinkers versus drinkers. And what they're saying is that a significant fraction of the population that's not drinking are people that have got sick from drinking, that have got some sort of disease associated with alcohol, and they're on their last legs. And that's why people that drink a little bit seem to live longer than people that don't. It's a fact that there's this confounding factor in the control group, effectively. Now, a recent looking into this, certainly that does affect the data. And certainly that is a true confounding hypothesis in many cases studies. A recent systematic review, however, showed that daily low or moderate alcohol intake was not significantly associated with mortality risk, looking across the board at all causes of mortality. And the message was that there were other things you should worry about more than moderate alcohol intake. I remain skeptical on this particular judgment, I guess, that moderate alcohol intake is as damaging as Dr. Butt's committee has claimed. They've yet to publish their assessment in a peer-reviewed journal, although he indicated that this was the plan. So I'm looking forward to seeing this reviewed in the open literature by the peers and to see if his very strict assessment of the guidelines for alcohol are actually supportable from the evidence, as some of the data seems to suggest that it's not necessarily supportable. So between these two alcohol episodes, I also interviewed Dr. Tracy Mann of the Healthy Eating Lab. She's also the author of a recent book called Secrets from the Eating Lab. And she told us that dieting doesn't work to take off weight over the long term. All diets work by caloric restriction in the short term, and they do cut down weight, cut down body weight and mass. And, for that, in the short term, they're good for you. However, her quote was, "It is much easier to improve health and maintain healthy eating habits than to lose weight and maintain that." She notes that the body has kind of an equilibrium mass that it approaches, and fighting that is very difficult. The body adapts to different caloric intakes and tries to keep a certain amount of fat on your body because that protects you in cases of lack of food, in cases of famine, and your body forces you to focus on food. And if you're doing a caloric restriction, it takes extreme amounts of willpower to not revert back to your original weight. And in fact, in the vast majority of cases, over a year or two, people all revert back and sometimes even shoot past their original weight. So that, I think, is something to keep in mind when looking at various fad diets. The better approach is to eat healthy. Eat enough food, enough healthy food to keep you sated. Now, following Dr. Mann's talk, I talked to Dr. Walter Longo, the founder of the Prolong diet, and his work is associated with fasting and the longevity and health advantages of intermittent fasting. Now, he highlighted that research shows advantages for people who fast for at least 12 hours consecutively every day. Example, 8 p.m. to 8 a.m. However, people who skip breakfast, say fasting from midnight to noon, on the evidence do not fare as well. So I challenged him about whether gains from fasting were just due to the caloric restrictions associated with not snacking during this period. And he countered that health-wise, weight is just a minor component compared to the power of aging. And what he tells us is that intermittent fasting actually resets some of the body's clocks. Some of the cellular aging is actually reset when you fast. And it's kind of like a fountain of youth. And looking at other animal studies, rats and mice and worms, this sort of thing actually significantly can lengthen lifespans. So I think this is a very useful and interesting result. His Prolong diet is like a 5-day fast. He provides food for it, and he claims that he doesn't earn any money from it. He donates the profits to research. So all in all, I think a very interesting interview and worthwhile following up on that and listening. And then most recently, I interviewed Dr. Joel Fuhrman, who is a very energetic and charismatic proponent of something he calls the nutritarian diet. And he has a retreat in San Francisco, I believe, where he trains people to eat the nutritarian diet. And online, there was a lot of criticism regarding this diet, that it was overly caloric restrictive and very hard to follow. And I guess that's why they have the retreat, because you really need to train hard to stick to it. And so, and I raised this complaint with him, and he said, well, if you don't want to do it, you don't have to. So, yeah, okay, good point. So he claimed that his program of eating nutritious foods and cutting back on processed foods could not only reduce cholesterol and heart disease and diabetes, it could actually reverse, in a lot of cases, could reverse the course of autoimmune diseases. But in his excitement to advocate for this, he made several what I would consider populist claims about the failures of mainstream doctors not wanting to go the extra mile and learn about his diets and listen to the latest evidence, and which I found a little bit disconcerting. It seemed like a little bit over the top advertisement, and you don't want to throw the good doctors under the bus, because they are waiting for actual data on some of these things. And he, to Dr. Fuhrman's claims, he did say that he does have data on the success of his diet in terms of treating some things, and he's published papers on it. So it's not that there is no data out there, but maybe it needs to be reproduced by independent labs. He made all of these claims. He also had a good acronym called GBOMS. So he stresses these things. GBOMS stand for greens, beans, onions, mushrooms, berries, and seeds as the basis for this nutritarian diet, and with supposed health benefits associated with these particular foods. And he rattled off a very tasty sounding list of vegetarian recipes and ingredients and sauces that, even with a very calorie restrictive diet, sounded very, very yummy. And so that's where I'm at right now on my investigation of nutrition and health. I'm still awaiting an episode on the gut microbiome and health, which I think is important to learn about how the microbial flora and fauna in our digestive tract affect our health and our brain. There's actually a really strong connection between the microbiome in our gut and how we feel and how we live in our health. And so I'm really looking forward. I've got an interview lined up, but it's not for a few weeks yet, with an authority, Dr. Jack Gilbert. So stay tuned for that. I think you're really going to like it. So what are my take-home messages from all of this investigation? And thank you for sticking with me this far into the podcast. Personally, I have actually changed my eating habits based on this research. I'm trying to eat healthier, avoiding some of the late night snacks and processed chips that I love, because I do see the impacts of that on my weight, and I want to avoid the impacts of that extra weight on my health. I'm also trying to get a solid 12 hours of fasting every day, following Dr. Longo's advice, and, moderating alcohol intake. That's something that I have been doing for some time. Definitely a useful piece of advice. Also trying to eat more GBOMS and not dieting. So if you stuck with me this long, thank you for listening. I appreciate your support, and I hope you've also learned something. Stay tuned for more.
If you'd like to follow up with more in-depth discussions, please come find us on Facebook at The Rational View and join our discussion group. If you like what you're hearing, please consider visiting my Patreon page at patron.podbean.com/therationalview. Thanks for listening.